The autumn of 1858 brought an unusual chill to the Mississippi Delta, as if nature itself sensed the violence that would soon stain the rich soil of Magnolia Grove Plantation. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a historian specializing in antebellum Southern history at the University of Mississippi, had spent the better part of 3 years researching what local records euphemistically referred to as the Thanksgiving incident of 1858. What Dr. Hartwell had uncovered was far more complex and horrifying than the sanitized historical accounts suggested. The official records spoke of a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of 15 prominent plantation owners during a Thanksgiving gathering. But buried in personal letters, slave narratives collected decades later, and carefully hidden documents, a very different story emerged. One of calculated revenge, meticulous planning, and a coordinated uprising that had been systematically erased from official history. The story began with the Blackwood family, owners of Magnolia Grove, one of the largest and most prosperous plantations in Yazoo County, Mississippi. Cornelius Blackwood had inherited the plantation from his father in 1845, along with over 400 enslaved people who worked the vast cotton fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Unlike some plantation owners who maintained a facade of paternalistic care, Blackwood was known throughout the region for his exceptional cruelty. Dr. Hartwell had found numerous accounts of Blackwood's brutality in the papers of neighboring plantations. A letter from Sarah Pemberton, wife of a nearby plantation owner, described visiting Magnolia Grove in 1857. "I was horrified by what I witnessed at the Blackwood plantation. The treatment of the Negroes there is beyond anything I have seen, even in our harsh system. Mr. Blackwood seems to take pleasure in devising new punishments, and his overseer, a man named Jeremiah Colt, is, if anything, worse than his master." The overseer, Jeremiah Colt, was a man whose reputation for violence extended far beyond Magnolia Grove. Born in poverty in Alabama, Colt had worked his way up from field hand to overseer through a combination of cunning and brutality that impressed even the most hardened plantation owners. He had been hired by Cornelius Blackwood specifically because of his reputation for maintaining discipline among enslaved populations. But it was not just the day-to-day brutality that made Magnolia Grove a powder keg waiting to explode. Dr. Hartwell had discovered evidence of something far more sinister, a systematic program of what could only be described as human experimentation. Hidden in the plantation's medical records, which had somehow survived in the archives of a local church, were detailed accounts of procedures performed on enslaved people without their consent. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the plantation's physician, had apparently been conducting experiments on enslaved people that ranged from testing new surgical techniques to administering unknown substances to see their effects. His journal, which Dr. Hartwell had found in the estate papers of Whitfield's descendants, contained entries that were difficult to read without feeling physically ill. November 15th, 1857. Administered the new compound to 3 subjects today. The effects were immediate and severe. 2 subjects experienced violent convulsions, while the third appeared to lose consciousness entirely. Will continue observations to determine long-term effects. December 3rd, 1857. Attempted the new surgical procedure on a female subject. The technique shows promise, though the subject did not survive the operation. Will refine the approach for future attempts. These experiments were not conducted in secret. Dr. Hartwell had found evidence that other plantation owners and physicians from across the region regularly visited Magnolia Grove to observe Whitfield's work. The Thanksgiving gathering of 1858 was, in fact, planned as much around these demonstrations as around the traditional holiday celebration. The guest list for that fateful Thanksgiving was a who's who of the Mississippi Delta's plantation elite. Besides the Blackwood family, Cornelius, his wife Margaret, and their 3 adult children, the gathering would include the Pembertons from Riverside Plantation, the Ashfords from Willowbrook, the Montgomerys from Cedar Hill, and the Rutherfords from Oakwood Manor. Also in attendance would be Dr. Whitfield, Overseer Colt, and several other physicians and plantation managers who had come to witness the latest in what they considered scientific advancement. But among the enslaved population of Magnolia Grove, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. At the center of this preparation was a man known only as Solomon, whose real name had been lost to history, but whose intelligence and leadership had made him a natural leader among the enslaved community. Solomon was not typical of the enslaved population at Magnolia Grove. According to fragments of testimony collected by abolitionists in the 1870s, he had been born free in Philadelphia and had received an education before being kidnapped and sold into slavery in his early 20s. His literacy and knowledge of the outside world made him invaluable to Blackwood, who used him as a bookkeeper and manager, but it also made him acutely aware of the injustices of his situation. Dr. Hartwell had found references to Solomon in several sources, including a letter from a traveling minister who had visited Magnolia Grove in 1856. "I was struck by the intelligence and dignity of one of Mr. Blackwood's Negroes, a man called Solomon, who manages much of the plantation's correspondence. He speaks with the education of a gentleman, yet is treated as property. I fear that such a man, with such knowledge of freedom, must suffer greatly under his current circumstances." Solomon had not suffered alone. Over the months leading up to Thanksgiving 1858, he had quietly built a network of trusted allies among the enslaved population. This network included Ezra, a blacksmith whose skills gave him access to tools and weapons; Miriam, a house servant who could overhear the conversations of the white family and their guests; and Thomas, a field hand whose size and strength had made him a target for particularly brutal treatment, but who had never been broken in spirit. The planning for what would become known as the Thanksgiving Massacre had begun in earnest in September 1858, when Dr. Whitfield announced that the upcoming Thanksgiving gathering would feature his most ambitious experiment yet. According to Miriam's later testimony, recorded by an abolitionist interviewer in 1879, Whitfield planned to demonstrate a new surgical procedure that would involve operating on several enslaved people simultaneously while the gathered plantation owners watched. Dr. Whitfield was excited like a child with a new toy, Miriam recalled. He kept talking about how this would be the greatest demonstration yet, how the other doctors would be amazed by what he could accomplish. He didn't see us as people at all, just things to be cut up for his entertainment. It was this announcement that finally pushed Solomon and his allies to action. They had endured years of brutality, had watched friends and family members disappear into Whitfield's experiments, had seen children sold away from their mothers and husbands separated from their wives. But the prospect of being used as entertainment for a gathering of the region's most powerful men was more than they could bear. The plan they developed was audacious in its scope and meticulous in its detail. Rather than a spontaneous uprising driven by rage, this would be a carefully coordinated operation designed to eliminate not just their immediate oppressors, but the entire power structure that supported the plantation system in their region. Solomon's education proved invaluable in this planning. He understood that simply killing Blackwood and his family would accomplish nothing. Other plantation owners would step in, new overseers would be hired, and the system would continue. But if they could eliminate a significant number of the region's plantation elite simultaneously, they might create enough chaos to allow for a mass escape to the north. The timing of Thanksgiving provided the perfect opportunity. With 15 of the region's most prominent plantation owners gathered in one location, along with their key managers and supporters, a single coordinated strike could decapitate the local power structure. Moreover, the holiday atmosphere would provide cover for the unusual activity required to position people and weapons. Ezra's role as blacksmith was crucial to the plan. Over the course of several weeks, he had quietly forged additional tools that could serve as weapons. knives, hammers, and even a few crude spears. These were hidden throughout the plantation buildings, positioned where Solomon's allies could access them quickly when the time came. Miriam's position in the house gave her access to information about the guests' schedules and sleeping arrangements. She learned that the men would be gathering in the main parlor after dinner to smoke and discuss business, while the women would retire to the drawing room. Dr. Whitfield's demonstration was scheduled for the following morning, which meant that all the guests would be staying overnight. Thomas and several other field hands were responsible for ensuring that the plantation's dogs, trained to track runaway slaves, would be neutralized before the operation began. They had been feeding the animals a mixture that would make them sick, but not kill them, timing the dosage so that the dogs would be incapacitated on Thanksgiving night. But perhaps the most crucial element of the plan was psychological. Solomon understood that their success would depend not just on violence, but on the shock and confusion that would result from the sudden reversal of the plantation's power structure. The enslaved people had been conditioned to see their masters as all-powerful, invincible figures. Demonstrating that these men could be killed would shatter that illusion and potentially inspire others to join the uprising. As Thanksgiving Day 1858 dawned, both sides were preparing for what they expected to be a memorable occasion, though for very different reasons. The plantation owners arrived throughout the day, their carriages rolling up the long drive lined with ancient magnolia trees. They came dressed in their finest clothes, bringing gifts and good cheer, completely unaware that they were walking into what Solomon had planned as their tomb. Cornelius Blackwood played the gracious host, welcoming his guests with bourbon and cigars, boasting about his plantation's productivity and the effectiveness of his management techniques. Dr. Whitfield excitedly described the demonstration he had planned for the following day, explaining how his new surgical techniques could be applied to make enslaved people more productive by removing their capacity for rebellion. "Imagine," Whitfield told his rapt audience, "if we could surgically alter the Negro brain to remove the capacity for defiance while leaving intact the ability to work. We could create the perfect laborer, strong, obedient, and incapable of uprising." The guests murmured their approval, discussing the potential applications and profits that such a procedure might generate. None of them noticed the enslaved people serving their dinner, refilling their glasses and attending to their needs. They had become so accustomed to treating enslaved people as invisible that they failed to see the hatred burning in their eyes or the careful coordination of their movements. As the evening progressed and the guests settled into their post-dinner activities, Solomon's network moved into position. The months of planning were about to be put to the test, and by morning, the power structure of Yazoo County would be forever changed. The enslaved people of Magnolia Grove had endured years of brutality, experimentation, and dehumanization. But on this Thanksgiving night, they would finally have their revenge. The massacre that was about to unfold would be swift, brutal, and complete. A reckoning that had been building for years and would finally explode in a single night of coordinated violence. Dr. Hartwell, reading through the fragmentary accounts and piecing together the evidence, could only imagine the mixture of fear, determination, and desperate hope that must have filled the hearts of Solomon and his allies as they prepared to strike. They knew that failure would mean not just their own deaths, but likely the deaths of everyone they cared about. But they also knew that success might mean freedom, not just for themselves, but for hundreds of others who suffered under the plantation system. The stage was set for one of the most significant but least known uprisings in American history. A night when the oppressed would become the oppressors and the masters would learn what it meant to be powerless. As the grandfather clock in the Magnolia Grove mansion chimed 10 o'clock on Thanksgiving night 1858, Solomon stood in the shadows of the servants' quarters, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination. Everything they had planned for months was about to unfold. There would be no turning back after tonight. Either they would strike a blow for freedom that would echo through history, or they would all die in the attempt. The signal came at precisely 10:15 p.m. when Miriam appeared at the kitchen window and extinguished the oil lamp twice, the agreed-upon sign that all the guests had settled into their evening activities and the house servants were in position. Solomon took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to a god he wasn't sure was listening, and gave the nod to Ezra, who had been waiting in the doorway of the blacksmith shop. The first phase of the operation targeted the plantation's security infrastructure. Thomas and 3 other field hands moved silently toward the overseer's quarters, where Jeremiah Colt was known to keep a collection of firearms. Colt himself was in the main house, participating in the evening's festivities, but his quarters contained enough weapons to arm a small militia, weapons that could not be allowed to fall into the hands of any survivors. Meanwhile, Ezra and 2 assistants made their way to the stables, where they would ensure that none of the guests' horses could be used for escape or to summon help from neighboring plantations. The plan was not to kill the animals. Solomon had insisted that unnecessary violence be avoided, but to release them into the night, making pursuit impossible. Inside the mansion, Miriam moved through the halls with the practiced invisibility of a house servant, but tonight her purpose was far different from her usual duties. She carried with her a small vial of liquid that Ezra had prepared, a mixture of herbs and compounds that would render anyone who consumed it unconscious within minutes. Her task was to add this mixture to the brandy that the men were drinking in the parlor and the sherry that the women were sipping in the drawing room. The timing had to be perfect. Solomon's plan depended on neutralizing as many of the guests as possible before the actual killing began, both to reduce the risk to his people and to prevent anyone from escaping to raise the alarm. But the dosage had to be carefully calculated. Too little, and the guests would remain alert and dangerous. Too much, and they would die from the poison itself, robbing Solomon of the satisfaction of looking his oppressors in the eye as they died. Dr. Hartwell had found Miriam's account of this night in a collection of slave narratives gathered by abolitionists in the 1870s. Her description of moving through the mansion, serving drinks to people who had never seen her as anything more than a piece of property, was both chilling and heartbreaking. "I walked among them like a ghost," she recalled. "They talked about us like we were animals, planning what they would do to us the next day. How Dr. Whitfield would cut us open for their entertainment." Mrs. Blackwood was telling the other ladies about a new punishment her husband had devised, laughing as she described how we screamed. And all the while I was pouring their poison, knowing that in a few minutes they would learn what it felt like to be helpless. The poison worked exactly as Ezra had promised. Within 20 minutes of consuming the doctored drinks, the guests began to feel drowsy and disoriented. At first, they attributed their condition to the large meal and generous amounts of alcohol they had consumed. But as their vision began to blur and their limbs grew heavy, some of them began to realize that something was wrong. It was Dr. Whitfield who first understood what was happening. As a physician, he recognized the symptoms of poisoning, and his medical training allowed him to maintain some clarity even as the drug took effect. "We've been poisoned," he managed to say, his words slurred but still comprehensible. "The servants, they've done something to the drinks." But it was too late. The guests found themselves unable to move, their bodies betraying them just as they had betrayed the bodies of so many enslaved people over the years. They could see and hear what was happening around them, but they were powerless to resist or escape. This was the moment Solomon had been waiting for. As the guests slumped in their chairs, struggling against the effects of the poison, he and his allies entered the mansion through doors that Miriam had left unlocked. They moved with purpose and precision, each person knowing exactly what their role would be in what was to come. Solomon himself went directly to the parlor, where Cornelius Blackwood sat slumped in his favorite leather chair, his eyes wide with fear and rage, but his body unable to respond to his commands. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the enslaved man who had been treated as property and the plantation owner who had never seen him as human. "You recognize me, don't you, Mr. Blackwood?" Solomon said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. I'm the one who keeps your books, who manages your correspondence, who knows every detail of how this plantation operates. I'm the one you've never seen as anything more than a useful tool." Blackwood tried to speak, but the poison had affected his ability to form words. He could only make guttural sounds as Solomon continued. "For 3 years, I've watched you torture my people. I've seen you sell children away from their mothers. I've watched you beat men to death for the crime of looking you in the eye. I've seen Dr. Whitfield cut open my friends while you watched for entertainment. And through it all, you've never once considered that we might be human beings with thoughts and feelings and the capacity for revenge." Solomon reached into his coat and withdrew one of the knives that Ezra had forged. The blade gleamed in the lamplight as he held it up for Blackwood to see. "This is for every child you sold, every woman you violated, every man you murdered," Solomon said. "This is for all the people whose names you never bothered to learn, whose lives you destroyed without a second thought. And this is for the future, for all the children who will never have to suffer under your hand." What happened next was swift and brutal. Solomon's knife found its mark with surgical precision, and Cornelius Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in Mississippi, died in his own parlor, killed by a man he had never considered capable of such action. Throughout the mansion, similar scenes were playing out. Ezra had taken responsibility for Jeremiah Colt, the overseer whose cruelty had made him hated even among men accustomed to violence. Thomas confronted Dr. Whitfield, the physician whose experiments had turned human beings into laboratory subjects. Miriam herself took part in the killing of Margaret Blackwood, the plantation owner's wife, who had delighted in devising new tortures for enslaved women. The other guests, the visiting plantation owners and their families, met similar fates. Each death was personal, carried out by someone who had suffered under that particular individual's cruelty. This was not random violence, but calculated justice, administered by people who had been denied any other form of redress for years of brutality. Dr. Hartwell had struggled with how to present this part of the story in his research. The violence was undeniably horrific, and he knew that many readers would focus on the brutality of the killings rather than the context that had made them inevitable. But he also understood that sanitizing the account would do a disservice to both the victims and the perpetrators of that night's events. What happened at Magnolia Grove was not a spontaneous explosion of rage, Dr. Hartwell wrote in his notes. It was the logical result of a system that treated human beings as property and denied them any legal or social recourse for the violence inflicted upon them. When people are pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, when they are denied every other means of seeking justice, violence becomes inevitable. The killing took less than an hour. By midnight, all 15 of the plantation's guests were dead, along with Cornelius Blackwood and his family. The mansion that had been filled with laughter and conversation just hours earlier was now silent, except for the sound of Solomon and his allies moving through the rooms, gathering supplies for what they knew would be a difficult journey north. But the night's work was not yet finished. Solomon understood that their actions would bring swift and brutal retaliation from other plantation owners in the region. Every enslaved person at Magnolia Grove was now in mortal danger, whether they had participated in the uprising or not. The only hope for survival was immediate escape. The plan for the aftermath had been as carefully thought out as the massacre itself. Solomon had studied maps of the region and identified a route north that would take them through swampland and forest, avoiding the main roads where they would be most vulnerable to pursuit. He had also made contact with conductors on the Underground Railroad, though he knew that moving such a large group would be unprecedented and extremely dangerous. As his allies gathered food, weapons, and other supplies from the mansion, Solomon made his way to the slave quarters to wake the rest of the plantation's enslaved population. Many of them had been kept ignorant of the plan for their own protection. If the uprising had failed, their ignorance might have saved their lives. But now that it had succeeded, they all faced the same choice: flee north toward an uncertain freedom, or remain and face certain death when the authorities arrived. The response was not what Solomon had expected. While some of the enslaved people were eager to join the escape, others were terrified by what had happened and afraid to leave the only home they had ever known. A few even expressed anger at Solomon for putting them all in danger without their consent. "You've killed us all," said an older woman named Ruth, who had worked in the plantation's kitchen for 30 years. "When the other masters find out what happened here, they'll kill every Negro in the county. How could you do this without asking us?" Solomon had anticipated this reaction, but it still pained him to see the fear in the eyes of people he had hoped to liberate. He understood that not everyone would see the massacre as he did, as a necessary step toward freedom. For many of the enslaved people at Magnolia Grove, the plantation was a place of suffering, but also of community and familiarity. The prospect of fleeing into the unknown was as terrifying as the prospect of remaining. "I won't force anyone to come with us," Solomon told the assembled crowd, "but I want you to understand what will happen if you stay. The authorities will assume that everyone here was part of the uprising. They won't distinguish between those who participated and those who didn't. If you remain, you will die." In the end, about 2/3 of the plantation's enslaved population, nearly 300 people, chose to join the escape. The others, mostly older individuals and those with young children, decided to take their chances by remaining and claiming ignorance of the night's events. As dawn approached, Solomon led his followers into the Mississippi wilderness, beginning a journey that would test their endurance, their courage, and their commitment to freedom. Behind them, they left the bodies of 15 of the most powerful men in the region and a plantation system that would never recover from the blow they had struck. The Thanksgiving massacre was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Word of the uprising would spread quickly throughout the South, sparking both fear among slaveholders and hope among the enslaved. The hunt for Solomon and his followers would become one of the largest manhunts in antebellum Southern history, involving thousands of men and resources that the region could ill afford to spare. But for now, as they disappeared into the swampland of the Mississippi Delta, Solomon and his people had achieved something that many had thought impossible. They had struck back against their oppressors and lived to tell about it. Whether they would ultimately achieve freedom remained to be seen, but they had already accomplished something of immense historical significance. They had proven that the enslaved were not passive victims, but human beings capable of resistance, planning, and decisive action. The night of reckoning was over, but the story of what it meant was just beginning. The discovery of the massacre at Magnolia Grove sent shockwaves throughout the Mississippi Delta and beyond. When neighboring plantation owner James Pemberton arrived for a scheduled hunting expedition on the morning of November 26th, he found the mansion's front door standing open and an eerie silence hanging over the usually bustling plantation. What Pemberton discovered inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bodies of 15 of the region's most prominent citizens lay where they had fallen, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and disbelief. The parlor, where the men had gathered for their after-dinner cigars and brandy, looked like a battlefield. Blood had soaked into the expensive Persian rugs, and overturned furniture bore witness to the final moments of men who had never imagined they could be vulnerable to the people they had enslaved. Dr. Hartwell had found Pemberton's account of that morning in a letter the plantation owner had written to his brother in Virginia. "I have seen battlefields, Charles, but nothing prepared me for what I found at Magnolia Grove. These were not random killings, but something far more calculated and personal. Each man had been killed with precision, and there were signs that the perpetrators had taken time to arrange the bodies in ways that seemed almost ritualistic. It was as if they were making a statement, not just committing murder. Within hours of Pemberton's discovery, riders were dispatched to every plantation, town, and military installation within 100 miles. The news they carried was almost incomprehensible to a society built on the assumption of white supremacy and black submission. Enslaved people had not only killed their masters, but had done so with a level of organization and planning that challenged every assumption about the capacity of the enslaved for independent action. Governor William McWillie received word of the massacre by telegraph that afternoon and immediately declared martial law throughout Yazoo County. He dispatched 3 companies of the state militia to the area, along with federal troops from the garrison at Vicksburg. The manhunt for Solomon and his followers would involve over 2,000 armed men, making it one of the largest military operations in Mississippi since the Mexican-American War. But the authorities faced a problem they had never anticipated. They were hunting people who knew the land better than they did, and who had planned their escape route with the same meticulous care they had applied to the massacre itself. Solomon's education and his years of managing plantation correspondence had given him access to detailed maps of the region, and he had used this knowledge to plot a course through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Mississippi Delta. The route Solomon had chosen led north through the Yazoo backwater area, a vast expanse of swampland, bayous, and dense forest that even experienced hunters avoided. The terrain was dangerous enough under normal circumstances. Quicksand, poisonous snakes, and alligators made travel hazardous even for those who knew the area well. But for a group of nearly 300 people, including children and elderly individuals, the journey would be a test of endurance that would claim lives even if they avoided capture. Dr. Hartwell had traced Solomon's route using a combination of military records from the manhunt, Underground Railroad documents, and geographical surveys from the period. What emerged was a picture of a journey that was both strategically brilliant and almost impossibly difficult. Solomon understood that his group's size was both their greatest weakness and their greatest strength, Dr. Hartwell noted in his research. A smaller group could have moved faster and been harder to track, but they would have been more vulnerable to attack if discovered. A group of 300 people was harder to hide, but could defend itself if cornered. Solomon was betting that he could keep his people together long enough to reach Underground Railroad stations in Tennessee. Down the first few days of the escape went according to plan. Solomon's group moved primarily at night, using game trails and waterways to avoid leaving obvious tracks. During the day, they took shelter in the dense canebrakes and cypress swamps that dotted the landscape, posting guards to watch for pursuing forces while the rest of the group rested. The pursuing militia and federal troops, meanwhile, struggled with terrain they were not equipped to handle. Most of the soldiers were from urban areas or farming regions and had no experience with swampland navigation. Their horses became mired in mud, their supplies were damaged by constant moisture, and several men were lost to snake bites and other hazards. Colonel Marcus Whitmore, commanding the federal forces, reported his frustrations in dispatches to his superiors. "We are pursuing an enemy that knows this terrain intimately while we stumble through it like blind men. Our horses are useless in much of this country, our maps are inadequate, and our men are falling ill from the conditions. The fugitives have every advantage except numbers, and in this terrain, numbers may not matter." But Solomon's group was also suffering. The elderly and very young struggled with the physical demands of the journey, and several people died from exhaustion, exposure, and accidents during the first week. Food was scarce, and the constant stress of being hunted took a psychological toll that was almost as devastating as the physical hardships. It was during this period that Solomon's leadership was most crucial. Dr. Hartwell had found accounts from several survivors of the escape, collected by abolitionists in the 1870s and 1880s, that described how Solomon maintained morale and discipline even under the most desperate circumstances. "Solomon never showed fear, even when we could hear the dogs baying in the distance," recalled a woman named Sarah, who had been a field hand at Magnolia Grove. "He would move among us at night, checking on the sick, encouraging the frightened, making sure everyone understood what we were trying to accomplish. He reminded us that we were not just running away. We were running toward something. We were running toward freedom. I see. The breakthrough in the escape came during the second week when Solomon's group made contact with the Underground Railroad network. The connection was made through a free black man named Isaiah Washington, who operated a small farm near the Tennessee border and served as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Washington had been alerted to the group's approach by other conductors who had heard about the Magnolia Grove Massacre through the network of communication that connected Underground Railroad stations throughout the South. He had been watching for Solomon's group and was prepared to provide assistance, though the size of the group presented unprecedented challenges. "I had helped dozens of people reach freedom," Washington later told an interviewer, "but never anything like this. 300 people was more like a small army than a group of fugitives. I knew that my usual methods wouldn't work. We needed something completely different." Washington's solution was to split Solomon's group into smaller units that could be moved separately along different routes. This was dangerous because it meant dividing their defensive capabilities, but it also made them much harder to track and allowed them to use underground railroad stations that couldn't accommodate such a large group. The decision to split up was agonizing for Solomon. He had kept his people together through the most dangerous part of their journey, but now he had to trust that the smaller groups could survive on their own. Families were separated, friends were divided, and the community that had sustained them through the escape was broken apart. "It was like tearing apart a family," Solomon later wrote in a letter that Dr. Hartwell found in the papers of an abolitionist organization. "These people had risked everything to follow me, and now I was asking them to trust strangers with their lives. But I knew that staying together would mean capture or death for all of us." The strategy worked, but at a terrible cost. Over the following weeks, about 2/3 of Solomon's original group successfully reached free territory in Ohio and Canada. But nearly 100 people were captured or killed during the journey, and the psychological trauma of separation left lasting scars on those who survived. The pursuing forces, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly frustrated and desperate. The massacre at Magnolia Grove had shocked the entire South, and there was enormous pressure on the authorities to capture the perpetrators and make an example of them. When the traditional methods of pursuit failed, some of the pursuers began to resort to increasingly brutal tactics. Colonel Whitmore's dispatches from this period reveal a man under enormous pressure who was beginning to lose control of his forces. "Some of my men have begun taking matters into their own hands. They have burned several farms suspected of harboring fugitives and have interrogated local Negroes with methods that I cannot officially sanction. I fear that our pursuit of these criminals is creating more criminals in the process." The brutality of the manhunt had unintended consequences for the authorities. The indiscriminate violence against innocent enslaved people and free blacks created sympathy for Solomon's group and inspired others to provide assistance. Underground railroad activity in the region increased dramatically, and several new conductors emerged to help other fugitives escape. Dr. Hartwell had found evidence that the Magnolia Grove Massacre and the subsequent manhunt had a profound impact on the Underground Railroad network throughout the South. The success of Solomon's escape, despite the massive resources deployed against him, demonstrated that large-scale resistance was possible and inspired other enslaved people to attempt their own escapes. The Thanksgiving Massacre became a symbol of resistance throughout the enslaved community, Dr. Hartwell wrote. Word of Solomon's success spread through the slave quarters of plantations across the South, carried by the informal networks of communication that connected enslaved communities. For the first time, many enslaved people began to believe that organized resistance could succeed, but the manhunt also had a chilling effect on the white population of the South. The idea that enslaved people could plan and execute such a sophisticated operation challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of slavery and the capacity of the enslaved for independent action. Plantation owners throughout the region began implementing new security measures and treating their enslaved populations with even greater suspicion and brutality. The psychological impact of the massacre extended far beyond Mississippi. Newspapers throughout the South carried detailed accounts of the killings, often embellished with sensational details that heightened white fears of slave rebellion. The story was also picked up by northern newspapers, where it was presented as evidence of the inherent violence of the slavery system. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist and former enslaved person, wrote about the Magnolia Grove Massacre in his newspaper, The North Star. What happened in Mississippi was not an act of senseless violence, but the inevitable result of a system that treats human beings as property. When people are denied every legal means of seeking justice, when they are subjected to daily brutality and dehumanization, violence becomes their only recourse. We should not condemn Solomon and his followers for their actions. We should condemn the system that made such actions necessary. As winter approached, the manhunt began to wind down. Most of Solomon's group had either reached freedom or been captured, and the authorities were facing pressure to redeploy their forces to other duties. The massive cost of the operation, both in terms of money and manpower, was becoming a political liability for Governor McWillie. But the impact of the Thanksgiving massacre continued to reverberate throughout the South. The successful escape of so many of the perpetrators had demonstrated that the Underground Railroad was more extensive and effective than authorities had realized. The brutality of the manhunt had created new sympathizers for the abolitionist cause. And the very fact that enslaved people had been capable of such organization and planning had shattered comfortable assumptions about the nature of slavery. Solomon himself had successfully reached Canada, where he would spend the rest of his life working with abolitionist organizations and helping other fugitives escape from slavery. His story would become one of the most powerful testimonies to the capacity of enslaved people for resistance and the ultimate futility of trying to keep human beings in bondage. The hunt was over, but the legend of the Thanksgiving massacre was just beginning. By the spring of 1859, the immediate manhunt for Solomon and his followers had ended, but the reverberations of the Thanksgiving massacre continued to shake the foundations of Southern society. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, in his extensive research, had discovered that the events at Magnolia Grove had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the borders of Mississippi and contributed to the growing tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The most immediate impact was on the plantation system itself. The massacre had demonstrated that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated planning and coordinated action, shattering the paternalistic myth that they were content with their condition and incapable of organized resistance. Plantation owners throughout the South began implementing new security measures that transformed their properties into armed camps. Dr. Hartwell had found extensive documentation of these changes in plantation records and personal correspondence from the period. Guard patrols were increased, weapons were distributed to overseers and trusted house servants, and new restrictions were placed on the movement and assembly of enslaved people. The cost of these security measures was enormous, cutting significantly into the profits that made the plantation system economically viable. The Magnolia Grove Massacre marked the beginning of the end for the traditional plantation system, Dr. Hartwell concluded in his research. The security measures implemented in response to the uprising were so expensive and disruptive that they undermined the economic efficiency that had made large-scale slavery profitable. Plantation owners found themselves spending more on security than they were earning from increased production, but the economic impact was only part of the story. The psychological effect of the massacre on both the enslaved and enslaving populations was profound and lasting. For enslaved people throughout the South, Solomon's success became a powerful symbol of resistance and hope. Underground Railroad conductors reported a dramatic increase in escape attempts in the months following the massacre, as enslaved people who had previously accepted their condition began to believe that freedom was possible. The white population, meanwhile, lived in a state of constant fear and suspicion. The idea that their own enslaved people might be planning similar uprisings haunted plantation owners and their families. Sleep became difficult, social gatherings were curtailed, and the easy confidence that had characterized Southern society began to erode. Dr. Hartwell had found particularly revealing correspondence between plantation owners' wives, who bore much of the psychological burden of living in constant fear of the people who served in their homes. A letter from Martha Pemberton to her sister in Virginia, written in March 1859, captured the paranoia that gripped the region. "I can no longer look at our house servants without wondering if they are planning to murder us in our beds. Every whispered conversation between Negroes seems potentially treasonous. Every gathering in the quarters appears to be a conspiracy. James has armed all the overseers and installed new locks on every door. But I know that if our people truly wanted to kill us, no amount of security would stop them. We are outnumbered 10 to 1, and now we know that they are capable of anything." The massacre also had significant political ramifications. Southern politicians used the events at Magnolia Grove to argue for stronger federal support for slavery and more aggressive measures to prevent future uprisings. They demanded increased military presence in areas with large enslaved populations and called for new laws that would make it easier to suppress resistance. Northern politicians, meanwhile, pointed to the massacre as evidence of the inherent violence and instability of the slavery system. Abolitionist speakers used Solomon's story to argue that slavery was not only morally wrong, but also practically unsustainable, as it inevitably led to violence and social chaos. The debate over the Magnolia Grove massacre became part of the larger national conversation about slavery that was driving the country toward civil war. Dr. Hartwell had found extensive documentation of this debate in congressional records, newspaper editorials, and political speeches from the period. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, who would later become president of the Confederacy, used the massacre to argue for stronger federal protections for slavery. "The events in my home state demonstrate the need for decisive action to protect our constitutional rights and our way of life. We cannot allow a handful of murderous criminals to terrorize law-abiding citizens and destroy the economic foundation of our society." Senator William Seward of New York, who would later serve as Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, offered a very different interpretation. "The tragedy in Mississippi is not the result of criminal behavior by enslaved people, but the inevitable consequence of a system that treats human beings as property. When people are denied every legal means of seeking justice, violence becomes their only recourse. The solution is not more repression, but the abolition of the system that makes such violence necessary." Dr. Hartwell's research had also uncovered the remarkable story of what happened to the survivors of Solomon's group who successfully reached freedom. Many of them settled in Canada, where they established communities that became important stops on the Underground Railroad. Others remained in the northern United States, where they worked with abolitionist organizations and shared their stories with audiences who had never heard first-hand accounts of slavery's brutality. Solomon himself became one of the most effective speakers on the abolitionist circuit. His education and articulate manner made him a powerful advocate for the cause, and his role in the Magnolia Grove massacre gave him a credibility that few other speakers could match. He had not just escaped from slavery, he had struck back against it in a way that captured the imagination of audiences throughout the North. Dr. Hartwell had found extensive records of Solomon's speaking engagements in the archives of various abolitionist organizations. His speeches were carefully crafted to balance the moral arguments against slavery with practical demonstrations of the enslaved people's capacity for resistance and self-liberation. "I stand before you not as a victim seeking pity, but as a warrior who has struck a blow for freedom," Solomon told an audience in Boston in 1860. "The men we killed at Magnolia Grove were not innocent victims, but active participants in a system of oppression that denied our humanity and destroyed our families. We did not act out of hatred, but out of love. Love for our children who deserve to grow up free, love for our wives who deserve to be treated as human beings, love for ourselves and our right to dignity and self-determination." These speeches had a profound impact on Northern public opinion. Many white Americans who had been ambivalent about slavery found themselves moved by Solomon's first-hand accounts of the system's brutality. His story provided concrete evidence of slavery's dehumanizing effects and demonstrated that enslaved people were not passive victims, but human beings capable of resistance and self-liberation. The impact of Solomon's advocacy work extended beyond public opinion to practical action. His detailed knowledge of plantation operations and security measures made him invaluable to Underground Railroad conductors planning rescue operations. He helped design new escape routes, advised on security procedures, and trained other conductors in techniques for moving large groups of fugitives. Dr. Hartwell had also discovered evidence that Solomon's story inspired other enslaved people to plan their own uprisings. While none of these subsequent rebellions achieved the scale or success of the Magnolia Grove Massacre, they contributed to the growing atmosphere of instability that characterized the final years before the Civil War. The most significant of these inspired uprisings occurred in Virginia in 1860, when a group of enslaved people attempted to replicate Solomon's tactics at a plantation near Richmond. The uprising was discovered before it could be carried out, but the planning documents found by authorities showed clear influence from accounts of the Magnolia Grove Massacre. The Virginia conspiracy demonstrated that Solomon's story had spread throughout the enslaved community and was inspiring others to attempt similar actions, Dr. Hartwell noted. While the uprising failed, it contributed to the growing fear among Southern whites that their entire social system was under threat. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 overshadowed the memory of the Magnolia Grove Massacre, but its influence on the conflict was significant. Many of the enslaved people who joined Union forces as the war progressed had been inspired by stories of Solomon's successful resistance. The massacre had demonstrated that enslaved people could fight effectively against their oppressors, providing a model for the military service that would prove crucial to Union victory. Solomon himself attempted to return to the South during the war to organize resistance behind Confederate lines, but he was captured by Confederate forces in Tennessee in 1863. He was executed without trial, but his death only added to his legend among the enslaved population. Dr. Hartwell had found records of Solomon's capture and execution in Confederate military archives. The documents revealed that Confederate authorities considered him such a threat that they ordered his immediate execution rather than risk the possibility that he might escape or inspire others through a public trial. Solomon's execution demonstrated the extent to which Confederate authorities feared his influence, Dr. Hartwell observed. They understood that his story had become a powerful symbol of resistance, and that keeping him alive, even in captivity, posed an unacceptable risk to their cause. The end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery transformed the meaning of the Magnolia Grove Massacre. What had been seen as a criminal act by Southern authorities and a heroic act of resistance by abolitionists became part of the larger story of the struggle for freedom and civil rights. During Reconstruction, efforts were made to commemorate the massacre and honor its participants. A monument was erected at the site of the former Magnolia Grove Plantation, though it was destroyed by white supremacists during the Jim Crow era. The monument was rebuilt during the civil rights movement of the 1960s and stands today as a reminder of the courage and determination of those who fought for freedom. Dr. Hartwell's research had also uncovered the stories of the descendants of the massacre's participants. Many of the families who had escaped with Solomon established themselves as leaders in their new communities, using their experience of resistance to advocate for civil rights and social justice. Their descendants continued this tradition, participating in the Underground Railroad, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement. The legacy of the Magnolia Grove Massacre extends far beyond the events of that single night, Dr. Hartwell concluded. It represents a turning point in the history of resistance to slavery and a demonstration of the capacity of oppressed people to organize, plan, and fight for their freedom. The courage shown by Solomon and his followers inspired generations of civil rights activists and continues to serve as a model for those fighting against injustice today. The Thanksgiving Massacre of 1858 had begun as an act of desperate resistance by people who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. It ended as a symbol of hope and a demonstration that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful or entrenched, can ultimately survive when confronted by people willing to sacrifice everything for freedom. In his final analysis, Dr. Hartwell reflected on the broader meaning of the events he had spent years researching. The story of Magnolia Grove reminds us that freedom is not a gift that is given, but a right that must be claimed. Solomon and his followers understood that their humanity could not be recognized by those who profited from denying it. They chose to assert their humanity through action, knowing that the cost would be high, but understanding that the cost of inaction would be higher still. Ordained, the blood spilled at Magnolia Grove on Thanksgiving night 1858 had watered the seeds of freedom that would eventually bloom into the abolition of slavery and the expansion of civil rights. The massacre had been both an ending and a beginning, the end of the illusion that enslaved people would passively accept their condition, and the beginning of a new understanding of the power of organized resistance. Solomon and his followers had paid a terrible price for their freedom, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. Their story became part of the larger narrative of American freedom, a reminder that liberty has always required the courage of those willing to fight for it, even when the odds seemed impossible and the cost seemed unbearable. The end. Important disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and was created exclusively for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, historical details, and situations are products of imagination and do not represent real people, living or deceased, nor actual historical events. Any resemblance to reality is purely coincidental.